Have you ever wondered what life looked like exactly 100 years ago? Not just the headlines or the history books, but the quiet, everyday moments. The sound of footsteps on a wooden porch, the hum of a distant jazz tune drifting from an open window. A family gathered close, eyes fixed on a wooden radio glowing softly in the corner. Tonight, we invite you to step back to a time when the world had just begun to breathe again. The war was over. The scars were still fresh, but America was waking up. In color, welcome to Sleepytown Radio, where the stories come slow, the memories come softer, and the past feels like home. If you've come looking for rest, for stillness, or for the gentle echo of a world once simpler, you're in the right place. Tonight, we journey back to the 1920s, a decade unlike any before or after, a time of contradictions, of daring rebellion and quiet traditions, of rules written and broken, of cities growing upward and roads stretching outward. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and for good reason. But not everything roared. Some things whispered, some things lingered like the sweet scent of pipe tobacco in an old study. The jazz may have played loud, but the real heart of the 1920s beat in smaller rhythms. In Sunday drives through dusty roads, in the clink of a soda bottle beside a country store, in the hush of a speakeasy behind a bakery wall, where strangers became friends under dim light and forbidden song. This was the decade where America began to dream in motion. The first affordable cars rolled down gravel lanes, changing where families lived, worked, and wandered. Radio voices stitched the country together. Kansas farmers and Brooklyn school teachers listening to the same news, the same music, the same laughter, and all of it started here. So as you lie back tonight, let the noise of today grow distant. Let the worries settle. Close your eyes and let the years fall away. Imagine street lamps flickering on outside a silent movie theater. Picture a young couple dancing the Charleston in a neighbor's basement, their shadows dancing along the wall. This story isn't just about jazz and flappers. It's about people. People who lived, loved, worked, and wandered. Just like we do now. We'll begin, as many stories from that time did, with a law that tried to change everything and a country that refused to sit still. Prohibition and the birth of the speakeasy. But for now, just breathe. We're going back to 1920s America, and for the next little while, you don't have to be anywhere else. The year was 1920. The war had ended. The soldiers had come home. And across the quiet towns and crowded cities of America, something began to shift. Not with noise at first, but with color. There was a feeling in the air that hadn't been there before. A flicker of energy in the shop windows. A softness in the way people smiled again. It was as though the country had taken a long breath in and was now learning how to exhale. In the cities, the soot-blackened factories still roared with machines, but on the streets just beyond them, the world began to dance. Jazz melodies curled out from basement clubs. Children chased stickballs down alleyways. Women laughed freely, their hemlines daringly higher than before, their hats feathered and bold. In quiet neighborhoods, porches filled once again with conversation. Couples strolled after dinner, listening to the far-off rhythm of a neighbor's Victrola spinning something new, something American, something alive. It was a time when everything, fashion, music, art, manners, seemed to wake up from a long winter's sleep. There was rebellion, yes, but also joy. And underneath it all, a kind of curiosity. What else could life be? The young women were the first to change. Or maybe they were simply the first to be noticed. They cut their hair short, in sleek bobs that brushed their cheeks. They danced the Charleston and wore dresses that shimmered with beads and sequins, light enough to catch the swing of every step. They weren't trying to shock the world. They were trying to live in it. These were the flappers, girls who defied their mothers' corsets and their grandmother's silence. They smoked in public. They rode in cars without chaperones. They laughed loudly and didn't apologize for taking up space. But this wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a cultural reset. After the war, after the flu, after so much loss, they were determined not to live in fear. So they danced, and America, it seemed, danced with them. The music was different too. Gone were the parlor pianos and hymnals. Now came the syncopated rhythms of ragtime and jazz. Trumpets blared, saxophones swooned, and the drums carried it all forward like a heartbeat. Black musicians from New Orleans, Chicago, and Harlem brought their sound to the center stage. It was music born of sorrow, stitched with joy, and pulsing with life. In smoky rooms, white and black audiences gathered, sometimes illegally, often nervously, to share something unspoken. For a few hours, at least, music dissolved the boundaries that society had drawn in ink. There were other signs that the world was waking up. Painters threw away realism for abstraction. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald captured the ache of a generation, both hopeful and hollow. Even architecture was changing. Buildings grew taller, sleeker, reaching skyward like hands yearning for something new. Technology followed close behind. Electricity lit up not just homes, but imaginations. Refrigerators replaced iceboxes. Washing machines rolled into kitchens. The modern age was on the doorstep, and America, for better or worse, let it in. People wanted more than survival. They wanted beauty and style and rhythm. They wanted to feel alive, but beneath the shine, there was still something tender. Not everyone danced. Not everyone roared. Many still worked sunup to sundown. Many still prayed for rain, or waited for a letter from a son out west. Yet even in the quietest corners of the country, on porches in Tennessee, in schoolhouses in Nebraska, in barber shops in Utah, something had changed. There was movement now, a feeling that the world was not only bigger, but somehow closer. The small-town boy could hop a train to New York. The farmer's daughter might dream of California, and the world, for once, didn't laugh at them for trying. They didn't call it the Roaring Twenties at the time. That would come later, when the decade was already fading in the rear-view mirror. But for those living through it, the 1920s didn't feel like a roar. It felt like a sunrise, one long golden hour after the storm. And while not everyone danced the Charleston or wore pearls, nearly everyone, somewhere deep inside, felt the stirring, a sense that life was no longer something to endure, but something to create, to build, to sing, to shape. And so, with that soft awakening, America moved forward into electric nights, forward into underground bars and quiet rebellions, forward into fast cars, radio voices, and the glowing silver screen. But before any of that, there was a law. A single sweeping law that tried to stop the party before it ever really began. Let's step into the year 1920 and meet the unexpected spark that lit the fires of the decade: Prohibition. Just as America began to stir with life, its dresses brighter, its music louder, its people braver, something curious swept across the nation. On January 17, 1920, the sun rose on a country where alcohol was no longer legal. The 18th Amendment had taken hold. A grand experiment had begun. No more manufacturing, no more selling, no more transporting of intoxicating spirits. In the blink of an eye, the glass at dinner went dry. They called it Prohibition, and it was meant to make the country cleaner, safer, better. It was supposed to silence the rowdy barroom brawls and mend the broken homes, to steer men from the saloon and back to their families, to end crime and disorder and replace them with discipline and morality. It was on paper a noble vision, but the American spirit, wild, stubborn, and oddly poetic, has never liked being told what it cannot do. At first, there was confusion. Some towns poured their last barrels with mourning. Others cheered and held parades. But quickly, something began to shift. It didn't take long for the thirst to return, stronger, in fact, than before. And where the law closed one door, Americans opened another, behind bookshops, beneath bakeries, through the back of tailor shops. A hidden world began to unfold, filled with hushed voices and secret knocks. They called them speakeasies, and they became the glowing heart of the night. But before we step inside one, let us linger a while longer on the surface, because the world above was beginning to change. Law enforcement, overwhelmed and underpaid, found itself chasing shadows. For every illegal bar that was raided, 2 more seemed to open the next week. Bootleggers transported liquor through backwoods trails, across city lines, and under frozen lakes. Barrels were buried in fields, bottles hidden in baby carriages, moonshine brewed in sheds behind cornfields. It was a game of hide and seek that the authorities, in truth, were never quite winning. And behind it all was the quiet understanding that most people, deep down, didn't really want the party to end. There's something deeply American about it all. A law passed with hopeful ideals, met with clever rebellion and whispered resistance. And so, what was meant to be a silencing became instead a song, low at first, barely heard, but soon it would swell. Prohibition, meant to dry out the nation, had accidentally lit the fuse of its most vibrant underground culture. By candlelight and behind closed doors, a new kind of community formed. It wasn't just about the drinks. It was about being there, together, in secret, in laughter, in rhythm. For many, it was their first taste of jazz, their first time dancing with strangers, their first night feeling free in a country that seemed so desperate to contain them. And perhaps more remarkable still, these hidden spaces became melting pots. Rich men in tuxedos clinked glasses with waitresses. Black musicians played for white audiences. Immigrants, artists, clerks, poets, all sharing space, story, and sound. The walls that divided them by day seemed to dissolve after dark, because when the lights were low and the saxophones began to moan, no one asked who you were. Still, it wasn't without cost. Prohibition gave rise to organized crime, to corruption, to violence. Speakeasies were sometimes raided, bartenders arrested, musicians scattered mid-song. But even as the headlines warned of the chaos, the people kept returning, because for every clash with the law, there was still something electric in the air. A taste of rebellion, a sigh of freedom, a night worth remembering. Prohibition, in all its contradiction, did something unexpected. It reminded Americans that joy was not so easily contained, that music would find its way through the cracks, that even in the shadow of control, people would gather, would sway, would sing. It tried to tame a nation, and instead, it gave birth to its wildest dance. Now the music calls us closer, because hidden behind those walls, through sliding panels and whispered passwords, something magical awaits. In the next part of our journey, we'll step quietly into one of those speakeasies. We'll listen, we'll watch, we'll remember, because the roaring didn't begin in the daylight. It began underground, where the music never stopped. It wasn't marked by a sign. There was no menu in the window, no music spilling onto the street. From the outside, it looked like nothing at all. Just a dusty back door tucked between a bakery and a tailor shop. Maybe a flickering bulb above the alleyway, if you knew where to look. But behind that door, another world waited. A few quiet knocks, a pause, a small panel slides open. A pair of tired eyes glance through. A whispered word, maybe the name of a flower or a baseball team, and then the latch clicks. The door opens, and you're in. Warm light washes over your face like a blanket. The hum of conversation greets you first, low and intimate, like a secret shared between old friends. Then the music finds you. It doesn't crash in. It coils around you like smoke. A saxophone stretches its long arms through the air, followed by the gentle hush of a brushed snare drum. You've stepped into a speakeasy. Not a place on a map, but a moment suspended in time. Inside, the room is soft around the edges. The lighting is low, amber, forgiving. The tables are small and round, scattered like stories yet to be told. Glasses catch the flicker of candlelight. The air is heavy with perfume, pipe smoke, and something sweet that might be bathtub gin. It's crowded, but never rushed. People lean close to talk. They laugh not with volume, but with rhythm. There's no shouting here, no room for it. Only music, only the clink of glass, the shuffle of feet, the brush of sequins against worn wood. In one corner, a woman in a sapphire dress sways with her eyes closed. Not dancing exactly, just swaying, letting the notes move through her like memory. At the bar, a man in suspenders sits alone, rolling his glass slowly between his fingers. His hat rests on the stool beside him, his coat still damp from the rain, but his shoulders have softened. He is home, even if just for a song or two. On the stage, a small one, barely raised above the floor, the band plays on. The pianist's fingers are fast but gentle, skipping like stones across the keys. The upright bass hums low and steady, like a second heartbeat beneath the room. And the trumpet? It doesn't play. It sings. Long, aching notes that rise and fall like candlelight in a breeze. No one tells them what to play. They follow each other, nods and grins passed like secret handshakes. Jazz in its truest form, improvised, rebellious, alive. Sometimes a voice joins in. A woman with a gardenia in her hair. She doesn't belt. She doesn't roar. She leans in close to the microphone and whispers the song like it's meant only for you. And somehow, it is. This was the world Prohibition built by accident, a hidden world, a sacred world, where black and white, rich and poor, immigrant and native sat side by side, maybe for the first time in their lives, where names didn't matter, where pasts could be forgotten, where everyone, for one fleeting evening, could become someone else. Or better yet, become exactly who they were always meant to be. The Speakeasy was more than a bar. It was escape. It was resistance wrapped in rhythm. A quiet rebellion that smelled of bourbon and brass. Yes, it was illegal. Yes, it was fleeting. But that's what made it sacred. Every night was borrowed time. Every melody was a risk. Every laugh came with the thrill of getting away with it just one more time. And still, people came. Because outside, the world pressed in. The rules, the silence, the gray. But in here, there was color. Here, there was music. Here, there was something that felt a little like freedom. The night stretched on in warm waves. Dancers took the floor, their shoes tapping soft rhythms into the old oak. The Charleston, the Lindy Hop, movements born in joy, sharpened in basements like this. You didn't have to know the steps. You just had to feel the beat. And if your foot slipped, or your laugh was too loud, no one minded. The room held you. The music forgave you. And tomorrow was still far enough away not to worry about. Some nights, the music played until morning. Until the candles were stubs, the glasses were empty, and the first rays of dawn crept down alleyways. Then it was time to go, quietly, softly, back through the hidden door, back into coats and hats and Sunday shoes. But no one ever really left a speakeasy. They carried it with them. In the hum they whistled on the walk home. In the rhythm that stayed in their step the next day. In the ache to return, again and again, to that place where the music never stopped. And so it played on, night after night, in cities and towns, in cellars and storerooms, in the hearts of those who needed a little light in the dark. Because when the country tried to go quiet, the people simply found new ways to sing. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait to be invited. They simply walked into the room and changed everything. They were called flappers. Young women with bobbed hair, bold lipstick, and skirts that dared to brush the knee. Women who danced when the music called, laughed when the world frowned, and lived as if tomorrow wasn't promised. Because they had watched a generation lose its youth in the trenches of war. But to truly understand a flapper, you had to see her in motion. She didn't glide, she moved. Fast, loose, free. Her dress, fringed and sparkling, caught the rhythm of her hips like it had been stitched to swing. Her heels clicked across the floor in time with a jazz band that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She wasn't rebelling to make noise. She was reclaiming something that had been silenced for too long. Before the war, a woman's life was narrow. Hemlines were low. Voices were lower. Proper behavior was stitched tightly into corsets and taught at kitchen tables. A woman's role was to be gentle, agreeable, invisible if possible. But when the Great War broke out, the world turned upside down. Men left for battle. Women filled their jobs, ran factories, drove ambulances, delivered mail. They found strength in their sleeves and grit in their bones. And when the war ended, the world tried to put them back where they came from, but they wouldn't fit. So they cut their hair. They stepped into shorter skirts and longer nights. They learned to smoke, to drive, to vote. And they made sure their voices were heard in jazz clubs and at ballot boxes alike. To some, they were scandalous. To others, revolutionary. But most of all, they were visible, dancing in the open, no longer hiding in the corners of polite society. In the speakeasies, they were the rhythm. On the streets, they were the color. They turned the sidewalks of New York and Chicago into catwalks, pairing pearls with cloche hats, lipstick with mischief. They weren't just changing fashion. They were rewriting identity. They made choices that had nothing to do with husbands or fathers or tradition. They chose themselves. It wasn't always easy. Flappers were mocked in newspapers, warned against in sermons. They were accused of being immoral, unladylike, dangerous, and maybe they were, but only to a world that had grown too used to silence. These women had tasted the freedom of movement, and once you've danced with joy, it's hard to sit still again. In the afternoons, they met for tea in hotel lobbies and laughed louder than was proper. In the evenings, they drove their own cars to rooftop parties and leaned over balconies with cigarettes in hand. They read books. They debated politics. They fell in love, sometimes with men, sometimes with adventure. They lived with urgency, because deep down, they knew the world could change in a single telegram, and the night was never guaranteed. Not every woman in America became a flapper. Most didn't. But even those who stayed in longer dresses in quieter towns felt the tremor of change. They saw the photographs, heard the music, read the headlines, and something deep inside them stirred. A question, a possibility, a door that had always been closed, now slightly open. It wasn't just about dancing. It was about breathing, about choosing a life not assigned, but desired. That's what the flappers gave to the country. Not scandal, not rebellion, but permission. Permission to move, to feel, to step into the spotlight, even just for one song. And so they danced in nightclubs and parlors, on rooftops and sidewalks. They danced for freedom, for joy, for the right to be seen and known and remembered. They danced because movement was truth, because laughter was power, because their grandmothers had walked in silence, and they would not. By the end of the decade, the flapper would become a symbol, not just of style, but of a seismic shift in the soul of a nation. And though the music would eventually fade and the dresses would grow longer again, the echo of her heels tapping across the wooden floor still lingers in the American memory. Soft, certain, free. If you listen closely, even now, you can almost hear her, dancing alone in an empty room. Eyes closed, head lifted, a smile forming as the music swells. Just before the next great change. Before the 1920s, most Americans traveled the same way their grandparents had, on foot, by train, or behind a slow-moving horse and buggy. Life moved at the rhythm of hooves and wheels carved from wood, but by the middle of the decade, something remarkable had happened. The sound of neighs and carriage clatter gave way to the low purr of an engine, and the quiet revolution of the automobile was fully underway. It didn't arrive with a roar. It arrived in driveways, in Sunday mornings, in the dust kicked up by tires rolling over gravel. At the center of it all was a car with a name everyone knew, the Model T. Henry Ford's creation was more than a machine. It was a key that unlocked freedom for the average American. It had once been unimaginable. Only the wealthy owned cars. They were rare, luxurious things, chauffeured, polished, distant. But by 1925, Ford's assembly line had changed the rules. The Model T was affordable, dependable, and suddenly, everywhere. You could spot them parked in front of barber shops, bouncing along farm roads, lining main streets where hitching posts used to be. No longer symbols of status, they became symbols of possibility. For the first time, a working-class family could pile into their very own car, mother, father, children, and perhaps even the family dog, and go, not just down the street, but beyond the edges of the map they'd always known. A trip that once took hours by horse now took minutes. Visiting grandparents in the next town over was no longer an all-day event. Seeing the ocean, once a dream, became something you could plan. Americans didn't just drive to places, they discovered them. And with the car came new rituals. There was the early morning warming of the engine in winter, the packing of picnic baskets in summer, the slow roll past wheat fields, windows down, wind in your hair. Young couples took joy rides to nowhere in particular, just to be in motion. Children played games in the back seat, their cheeks warm from sun and laughter. Families created memories not around the table, but behind the wheel. The road, once only a line between 2 points, became a space of its own, a place where connection happened. But the transformation didn't end with families. The country itself began to shift beneath the tires. Dirt roads were paved with asphalt. Gas stations, new and glowing, popped up along highways like little beacons. Bridges spanned rivers once crossed only by ferry. Signs advertised motor oil, soda pop, and auto courts with vacancy signs flashing in neon. The shape of America was changing, and so was its sense of scale. What once felt far away now felt reachable. The horizon stretched out, not as a limit, but as an invitation. Of course, not all roads were smooth. In rural towns, many paths remained muddy and rough. Farmers learned to patch tires as well as they plowed fields. Neighbors stopped to help one another out of ditches. Dust clung to windshields. Springs creaked under the weight of unpaved dreams. But even so, the wheels kept turning, because what the automobile offered wasn't perfection. It was movement. And for a generation raised on stillness, that was more than enough. In cities, the streets grew louder. Horse-drawn carts mingled with motor cars. Traffic jams became part of the morning rhythm. New signs appeared. Stop. Yield. One way. Crosswalks were painted. Policemen learned to direct with gloved hands and whistles. A new language was forming, spoken not with words, but with signals and speed. And as the car became more than just a novelty, it began to shape identity itself. To own a car meant you had a direction. You had a place to be. You were going somewhere, even if you hadn't decided where. It's hard to overstate how deeply the automobile embedded itself into the American dream. It wasn't just about getting from A to B. It was about becoming a family that explored together. Becoming a teenager with the wind in their hair and a future wide open. Becoming a country no longer limited by train schedules or fixed destinations. The open road became a metaphor as much as a map. It promised escape. It promised arrival. It whispered, "You don't have to stay where you are." And so they drove out of cities, into small towns, past gas stations, diners, orange groves, and desert plains. They drove into new jobs, new homes, new romances. They drove to forget, to dream, to feel alive. And America, vast, imperfect, full of curves and climbs, unfolded beneath their tires. In the years ahead, cars would become faster, roads would grow longer, and travel would become more complicated. But here, in the heart of the 1920s, it was still simple. You turned the key, you heard the engine hum, you looked out toward the sun-bleached horizon, and you drove. By the mid-1920s, something new was happening on Sunday afternoons. Front porches were a little quieter. Church let out, but instead of settling in for naps or chores, families across America were doing something else, something that had once seemed impossible. They were going for a drive, not to any place in particular, not for any urgent reason, just to drive, to be together, to see what lay beyond the edges of their town. It was called the Sunday Drive, and for many American families, it became a weekly ritual, part motion, part magic. Fathers cranked the engines to life, wiping oil-streaked hands on handkerchiefs tucked in their back pockets. Mothers packed small baskets, cold lemonade, deviled eggs, maybe slices of pound cake wrapped in wax paper. Children scrambled into the back seat, pressed their faces to the window glass, and waited for the moment the tires would begin to roll. Sometimes they had a destination, a cousin's house, a country fair, a quiet cemetery where grandparents rested beneath oak trees. Other times, there was no plan at all. They turned left where they usually turned right, followed a dusty road just to see where it might lead, waved to strangers, stopped for ice cream, drove past fields of wheat so tall it swayed like the ocean. Inside the car, everything was different. There was no radio yet, no distractions, just the hum of the engine, the whistle of wind, and the occasional burst of laughter from the back seat. Mothers pointed out wildflowers on the side of the road. Fathers slowed down for squirrels. Children counted cows or guessed how many miles until the next town. Time moved slowly, and that was the point. These drives weren't about speed or distance. They were about presence, about sitting close, shoulders brushing, knees touching, the warmth of family held together in a small metal frame. They were about being away without really being far, a kind of freedom that didn't cost a hotel stay or a train ticket, just a few cents for gas and a willingness to roam. And then there were the road trips, longer journeys, often taken during school breaks or holidays. Car loaded to the brim, blankets, thermos jugs, maps folded a dozen times too many. There was something thrilling about leaving home for more than just an afternoon. The smell of fresh air outside your home state. The first glimpse of a mountain range you'd only seen in books. The joy of a roadside diner with pie that tasted like someone's grandmother had made it just for you. In the 1920s, motoring was still new enough that each trip felt like an adventure. Drivers kept toolkits in the trunk, just in case. Flat tires were expected, not dreaded. And if you got lost, you stopped to ask directions from the man at the gas pump. or the lady watering her roses out front. The road wasn't just a means to get somewhere. It was a place in and of itself. The gravel beneath the wheels, the curve of a hill revealing a valley bathed in sunlight, the way trees arched overhead like a cathedral of leaves. In the back seat, children often dozed off, their heads resting against a sibling's shoulder or swaying softly with the bumps in the road. Somewhere between towns, somewhere between laughter and silence, life felt simple, whole. Even today, many Americans can close their eyes and recall it. The scent of dust in summer, the squeak of a leather seat, the quiet joy of a family held together not by conversation, but by shared direction. The Sunday drive wasn't flashy. The road trip wasn't luxurious, but both were filled with something rarer than novelty: togetherness. There were no screens, no itineraries, only time and each other. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned golden, families turned back toward home, tired, content, a little sunburned, a little happier. The house came back into view. The porch light flicked on, but something had changed. They had seen a little more of the world, and in doing so, perhaps a little more of each other. It's easy to forget how small the world once was. How many people never left their county, their town, even their street? The car changed that, but it wasn't the machine alone. It was what people did with it. They drove to feel alive. They drove to feel close. They drove to make memories that would last longer than the road itself. And sometimes, the best part of the journey was simply sitting beside the people you love, watching the world roll by, and knowing you were already right where you were meant to be. As the family car rolled back into town, dust trailing behind like a fading memory, it was easy to forget that just a decade earlier, most roads in America weren't roads at all. They were muddy trails, wagon paths, uneven stretches of dirt carved by horse hooves and hopeful wheels. But now, in the 1920s, things were changing. America was laying down pavement, not just with concrete, but with intention. It began quietly, a new stretch of smooth road here, a bridge repaired there. At first, the improvements felt local, just a nicer drive to the next town over. But something larger was unfolding. Bit by bit, mile by mile, a vast and connected network was being born. And with it, the country itself was changing shape, becoming smaller, faster, and somehow more reachable. Paved roads meant more than smoother rides. They meant possibilities. For a farmer, it was the ability to get milk to market before it spoiled. For a teacher, it was the option to take a job in a town 2 counties over. For a young couple, it was the chance to visit parents on a Sunday and still be home by dusk. Along these new roads sprouted gas stations like tiny islands of comfort in the unknown. They were often simple: a single pump, a tin roof, maybe a Coca-Cola sign swaying in the wind. But they were vital. They offered directions, cold sodas, and reassurance. They were places where travelers could pause, breathe, and feel like they belonged, even in unfamiliar places. Then came the roadside diners, little shacks at first, serving hot coffee and pie to anyone who pulled in. Soon they grew into the stuff of legend: bright red stools, formica counters, menus painted by hand. They fed more than the stomach. They fed the spirit of the journey itself. And rising above the roads like beacons in the night were the neon signs. Buzzing softly in pinks and blues, they invited drivers to stop. Eat. Motel. open, simple words, but they carried a promise that out there, on some long stretch of highway, you weren't alone. The landscape was transforming. Where once there were only fences and fields, there now stood drive-in markets, auto garages, and shimmering oil signs spinning in the breeze. The road was no longer an interruption to daily life. It was daily life. For many towns, a new road meant survival. Being on the map, literally, could bring trade, tourism, and hope. People came. Businesses opened. Dreams expanded beyond the city limits. And for those who lived in places the road passed by, a different kind of silence settled in. It was as if the heartbeat of the nation had chosen its rhythm, and some corners had been left out. Still, most embraced the change, because the roads weren't just about leaving. They were also about returning. They brought sons and daughters home for holidays. They delivered newspapers, fresh bread, and letters postmarked from places never heard of before. On weekend mornings, you could hear the sound of tires crunching gravel. A family loading into the car, heading to somewhere they hadn't yet decided. Just following the road, there was something deeply American in that. That belief that the next bend might hold something worth remembering. It wasn't all perfect. Some roads were rough. Some journeys ended with overheated engines or wrong turns that led to nowhere. But even those mishaps became stories told later, under porches, around dinner tables, or beside campfires. They became part of the fabric because the road gave people something precious, movement with meaning. It gave children their first glimpse of distant cities. It gave elders a second chance at adventure. It gave couples the space to talk between towns as the world slipped by their windows in sepia tones. By the end of the decade, America was a different country than it had been in 1920, not because the people had changed, but because the roads had. They connected more than places. They connected stories. They carried laughter, heartbreak, anticipation, and everything in between. As twilight settled over another Sunday, headlights dotted the landscape like fireflies. Families were returning home, radios off, windows cracked, the last light of day spilling in through the windshield. And though the miles had passed quickly, the memories made along those roads would stay, etched not just on maps, but in hearts. Tomorrow, there would be work. Tomorrow, the world would hurry again. But tonight, the roads had done their part. They brought America a little closer together, one gentle mile at a time. The road had brought people places. But what happens when they decide to stay? As highways stitched their way across the American landscape, something quietly began to bloom just beyond the city edge. Not farms, not factories, but something new. Neighborhoods, suburbia, a fresh chapter of the American dream, written in rows of modest homes, white picket fences, and trimmed lawns under wide-open skies. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a few houses built near the new roads, close enough to the city for work, but far enough to hear the crickets at night. Families came with little more than hope and a set of keys. Some came from crowded apartments, others from small towns that had started to fade. But they all came for the same reason: a little space to breathe, to grow, and to begin again. These neighborhoods weren't grand. They weren't meant to be. They were quiet, predictable, kind. A place where you could hear the screen door creak open next door and know exactly who it was. Where kids rode bikes in circles, chasing each other until the porch lights blinked on. And tucked along these new roads, just beyond the neighborhood corners, stood the motels. Not the towering hotels of the cities, but small glowing rectangles with names like Sunny Rest, Whispering Pines, and Highway Haven. They were simple, just a few rooms, a neon sign, and maybe a soda machine that clinked when the bottle dropped. But for weary travelers, or families chasing the open road, they were a gentle stop between places, a place to rest, to recharge, and to feel, if only for a night, that they belonged. Motels carried the scent of sun-warmed gravel and soft linen sheets. They echoed with the muffled hum of distant traffic, the hiss of sprinklers at dusk, and the hush of radios playing through open windows. You could check in as a stranger and wake up feeling like you were part of something, part of a country that made space for wanderers, for workers, for dreamers on their way somewhere. And around the motels, little dreams grew. Mom and pop diners opened next door. Filling stations with glass-paneled garages lit up the evenings. Even small movie houses appeared. One screen, one showing, and popcorn in waxed paper bags. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't grand, but it was enough. Enough for a boy to look out the motel window and imagine life in the next town. Enough for a couple to sit on a wooden bench beneath a buzzing porch light and talk about someday. The birth of Suburbia was quiet, like most beginnings are. No parades, no headlines, just someone planting a rose bush beside a new front porch. Just a hand-painted vacancy sign being flipped at dusk. It was a promise that life didn't have to be fast to be full, that a home didn't need marble floors to be meaningful, that the in-between places, between cities, between days, between dreams, had their own kind of magic. And perhaps most of all, it was the sound of these places that stayed with you, the low thrum of tires on the highway just beyond the motel lot, the screen door tapping in the breeze, a distant whistle of a train passing in the night, sounds that didn't demand your attention, but wrapped around your memory like a lullaby. As the country pushed forward, upward and outward, there was something deeply grounding about these little outposts of rest and routine, a motel light flickering against a velvet sky, a quiet street curving gently through a neighborhood where nothing much happened, but everything that mattered did. And when the day finally ended, when the kids were tucked in with sand still between their toes, and the car keys were left on the nightstand under a motel lamp, there was a feeling that lingered, not one of arrival, not quite yet, but of being on the way, of being somewhere real, somewhere small, and somewhere entirely your own. In the distance, as evening deepened, a faint sound drifted through an open window. A voice, warm, crackling, carried through the airwaves. And just like that, the country that had found new homes and motels and miles of road was about to find something else, a way to stay connected, even when apart. The motel room was quiet now. A single lamp glowed dimly by the bedside, casting a warm amber hue across the wallpapered walls. The hum of distant cars had faded into the background, replaced by something softer, something almost magical. A voice. It came from a small wooden box sitting on a dresser, its dials glowing faintly in the dark. From the outside, it looked like a simple radio. But to those gathered near it, to the mother in her robe, to the children curled up on the quilt, to the father with his shoes still on, it was so much more. It was January 1925, and in homes from Kansas to Connecticut, in motels along quiet highways, and even in lonely train stations where travelers waited beneath flickering lamps. People were discovering something extraordinary. The radio didn't just speak, it connected. A child in Nebraska could hear the same piano tune playing in New York City. A farmer finishing chores could catch the evening news just as a woman in a Boston flat turned up the volume to hear the latest broadcast from KDKA or WGN. It was invisible, but real. Radios were still new then. Curious little boxes powered by tubes and wires, their signals stretching across towns like whispers on the wind. And yet what they carried was powerful. Laughter, news, music, the clatter of live performances, the gentle crackle of static between moments. In a time before television, before internet, before anything on demand, the radio was a shared ritual. Families would gather in their living rooms, sitting close, leaning forward, not to watch, but to listen. And in the listening, they imagined. They saw pictures in their minds. A baseball game in another state. A saxophone solo drifting through smoke-filled clubs. A president's voice echoing through war and peace. The radio gave America a single heartbeat. It pulsed through every rural farm and bustling city, through nights when the power flickered, through snowstorms and hot summer evenings, through joy and sorrow. It was there, always, whenever you needed to feel less alone. Even the simplest moments carried weight. A boy twisting the dial late at night, finding a station from 2 states away. A grandmother humming softly along with a gospel tune on Sunday morning. A husband and wife dancing slowly in the kitchen to a melody they both knew by heart. These were not loud moments, not grand, but they were true. And sometimes the radio offered escape. In a world still healing from war, still shifting from old ways into new, people sought comfort in the sound of voices that asked nothing of them, only to sit, to breathe, and to be present. The weather report could calm a restless mind. The hiss of a jazz band warming up could send someone drifting to sleep. A story told in 3 parts could keep someone company through a long, lonely night. It wasn't just about what was said. It was how it was said, with pacing, with pauses, with that unmistakable warmth that came through the airwaves like a hand resting gently on your shoulder. For many, the radio became a companion. It didn't need to be seen. It didn't need to explain itself. It was just there, a quiet presence, a familiar hum, a kind of magic you didn't question, only trusted. And as the years went on, it would remain a fixture even as new things came. Talking movies, big city theaters, neon lights. There was always a place for that little box in the corner of the room, always a reason to turn the dial, to find a voice, to be reminded that somewhere someone else was listening too. Tonight, as the family in the motel drifted off one by one, the voice kept speaking, telling stories, sharing laughter, filling the space with something warm and weightless. And just outside that glowing room, a quiet truth lingered that sometimes even the smallest sound can bring a whole nation together. Next door, someone else was already tuning in. Across town, another home flickered with that same golden light. And in every corner of the country, the radio played on, invisible and unforgettable. As this gentle current of sound carried on through the night, a new kind of screen was preparing to light up America. Not with voices this time, but with images. Stories not just heard, but seen. And in the hush between one chapter and the next, the music faded, making room for silence, the kind of silence just before the curtain rises. The radio had become a trusted friend, a voice in the stillness, a rhythm in the room. But when the voices fell quiet and the lights began to dim, another kind of magic emerged, not sound, but silence. And in that silence, something beautiful happened. It was Saturday night, and the little theater on Main Street was filling up. Couples filed in, wrapped in wool coats. Children clutched candy boxes, their shoes scuffing across tiled floors. Inside, the velvet curtains were already drawn open, revealing a large white screen waiting in silence. There were no previews, no voices, no surround sound, just flickering light and possibility. In the 1920s, going to the movies was a cherished ritual. It didn't matter if you lived in a small farming town or a bustling city. Every week, folks would gather in quiet theaters to share in something wondrous. For a few nickels, the world unfolded in black and white, and time itself seemed to slow. You didn't need words. The faces told the story. A tilt of the chin, a glint of mischief in the eyes, tears brimming, a hand placed over the heart. Back then, actors weren't just performers. They were painters in motion. Greta Garbo could convey heartbreak with a single glance. Harold Lloyd made you laugh and wince all at once as he dangled from a clock tower. Charlie Chaplin, the tramp, wasn't just a character. He was everyone trying to find joy in a world that didn't always make sense. A pianist sat in the corner, his fingers dancing across ivory keys as the picture flickered on the screen. Sometimes it was an entire trio: fiddle, piano, drums, each note carefully chosen to match the mood. Laughter in the music, tension in the silence between chords. It wasn't just a film, it was theater. It was emotion. It was a communal dream. There was something deeply intimate about watching a silent movie. You weren't just told the story, you were invited to feel it. Your imagination did half the work, filling in the sounds, the thoughts, the moments between moments. When someone kissed someone else, the whole room leaned in. When someone ran through rain in a long coat, you could almost hear the puddles. Though nothing played but music, theaters themselves were part of the experience. Many were ornate, pillars of gold, velvet seats, sweeping balconies. Even in small towns, movie houses carried a kind of quiet grandeur. You walked in from the dusty street and found yourself in another world. Here, time bent. Here, no one was poor or alone or forgotten. Everyone became part of the story. It wasn't just escape, it was reflection. Even when the settings were far away, Parisian rooftops, Arabian deserts, wild western plains, people saw pieces of themselves on that silver screen. Struggles, hope, love, longing, comedy and hardship, dignity in the everyday. And when the film ended and the lights gently rose, there was a shared hush, a quiet understanding. Eyes adjusting not just to the light, but to the world again. For some, the movies became a second home. Teenagers would sneak in after school, holding hands in the back row. Older couples would sit in silence, reliving memories through scenes on screen. Widows would come alone, their hearts held by the music and the flicker. It was a sanctuary, a slow breath in a fast-changing decade. And yet, in the stillness of those silent films, something new was stirring. The radio had taught Americans to listen. Silent cinema had taught them to feel. But now, something was coming that would change everything again. A voice, not through radio waves, but through film itself. Just beyond the horizon, in a studio bathed in hot lights, A man stood on a set and waited for his cue. And when he opened his mouth, when that first line echoed out from a speaker behind the screen, people didn't cheer. They froze, because it wasn't just a new moment in film. It was a new moment in America. But before that change came, before words filled the theater, the silence had one last song to sing. A piano chord faded, a soft tear welled in someone's eye, and the screen dimmed to black. It happened on an ordinary night. People walked into the theater expecting another silent picture. They took their seats. The lights dimmed. The projector began to hum. But what followed would mark the end of one era and the beginning of something no one quite expected. A man stood on the screen dressed in a tuxedo. He held a microphone, and then he spoke. "You ain't heard nothing yet." The voice belonged to Al Jolson, and the film was The Jazz Singer. It was 1927, and with those 7 words, the world of entertainment changed forever. It wasn't just the novelty of sound. It was the sheer shock of it, the intimacy, the realism, the sudden closeness between screen and soul. Until that moment, the silver screen had been a kind of dream, silent, graceful, distant. Now it had a pulse. Now it had a voice. People gasped. Some leaned forward in disbelief. Others wept quietly, overcome by something they couldn't explain. Even the ushers stood frozen by the theater walls, eyes wide. It was as if a statue had come to life, as if all the silent faces they'd known and loved, Garbo, Chaplin, Pickford, were suddenly ready to whisper back. And the audience? They weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. In the weeks that followed, talk of the Talkie spread like wildfire. Newspapers couldn't print fast enough. Families gathered around the dinner table to discuss what they had heard. Not seen, but heard. For years, movie stars had existed in the silent realm, flawless, untouchable. But now they had accents. Now they laughed, they argued, they sang. It made them more human, and somehow, even more magical. Studios scrambled to catch up. Microphones were hung from rafters. Scripts were rewritten. Directors who once worked in pure visual language had to learn how to listen. Even the actors faced a turning point. Those with charming voices rose overnight. Those with thick accents or awkward delivery quietly disappeared. It wasn't always fair, but it was a new world, and no one could turn back. In big cities, movie houses quickly installed sound systems. Lines stretched around the block. Tickets sold out days in advance. Theaters echoed not just with music, but with dialogue. A whisper, a cry, a lover's vow, laughter that wasn't cued by piano, but born in real time. Even in small towns, people began to dream of hearing the big screen speak. Little by little, one theater after another made the leap. A farmer from Nebraska, a seamstress from Georgia, a coal miner from Pennsylvania. They could now hear the very stories they once imagined in silence, and that changed everything. Of course, not everyone was ready to let go of the old ways. Some missed the poetry of silence. Some missed the power of expression that didn't need words. There were voices, gentle ones, who whispered that something might be lost in all this noise. But even they couldn't deny the wonder, because now, when a man in a fedora sang to the moon, you could hear the tremble in his voice. When a woman in pearls confessed her heartbreak, you could hear it catch in her throat. It wasn't just cinema anymore. It was memory. It was music. It was a new kind of closeness. And in the quiet space between words, between one sentence and the next, there still lingered the old magic. That same hush from the silent era, where hearts leaned in together, waiting, wondering, feeling. The talkies didn't replace wonder, they expanded it. Soon, entire genres blossomed: musicals, screwball comedies, gangster flicks, romantic dramas. The world on screen became richer, deeper, more complex, and somewhere, in a small theater on a quiet street, a young boy sat wide-eyed in the third row, listening to a movie speak directly to him. He would never forget it, and neither would the country, because after the jazz singer, America never watched movies the same way again. It began with a whisper. Then came music. And then came a nation leaning forward, ready to listen to its dreams out loud. Long before the term celebrity became a household word, before reality TV, tabloids, or social media, there were stars, not just people who acted in films, but icons who seemed to glow from within. Their images flickered on silver screens across the country. Yet somehow, they felt close, like friends or dreams we thought we knew. These were the kings and queens of early Hollywood, faces that lit up a nation. After the arrival of the talkies, a new chapter began, not just for film, but for fame itself. Names like Rudolph Valentino, Greta Garbo, and Clara Bow weren't just printed on movie posters. They were spoken in whispers behind soda counters, scribbled into diaries, cut from magazines and taped to bedroom mirrors. They weren't distant stars in the sky. They were real, almost reachable. Valentino, with his dark eyes and quiet intensity, became known as the Latin lover. Audiences swooned. Women wept at his films, and again at his funeral, where tens of thousands flooded the streets in mourning. His was a beauty that felt timeless, and a mystery that made hearts ache. Garbo, meanwhile, was all elegance and enigma. She didn't simply play roles, she haunted the screen. With every gaze, she seemed to speak without words, carrying entire worlds in a single look. "I want to be alone," she famously said. And yet, the world never stopped watching. Then there was Clara Bow, the original it girl, fiery, playful, magnetic. She wasn't polished like the others. She was electric. Audiences didn't just admire her, they wanted to be her. She laughed with abandon, danced without permission, and brought color to an era still learning to speak in sound. Movie houses became cathedrals, and these stars were the stained glass saints. Children begged for pennies to see their favorites on a Saturday matinee. Young couples went hand in hand, hearts fluttering in the dim light. Families sat in silence, sharing moments that didn't need explaining. And as those flickering faces smiled, cried, or fell in love, something stirred in the people watching. Hope, escape, recognition, aspiration. Because in those faces, Americans saw not just fantasy, but pieces of themselves. Back then, there was no paparazzi, no late-night interviews, no behind-the-scenes exposés. The stars lived mostly in shadows off-screen, preserved in mystery. But perhaps that was the magic. You didn't know what Garbo ate for breakfast. You didn't see Valentino walking his dog. And somehow, that made their on-screen presence bigger, like myths etched in celluloid. People didn't just go to the movies, they believed in them. Studios understood this power. They sculpted images, controlled narratives, and curated dreams. There were training schools for how to walk, speak, and even smile. Every close-up was a calculated invitation. Every storyline, a whisper of something better. And the public? They welcomed it, because the 1920s were not just roaring. They were searching for identity, for healing after war, for meaning in motion, for something brighter than the dust and difficulty that still lingered in many towns. Hollywood delivered that brightness, not as a distraction, but as a possibility. These stars, shimmering on screens in towns large and small, gave America something to hold on to, a reason to dress up, to go out, to feel beautiful or brave or romantic again. They weren't perfect, but they reminded us that somewhere between the hard days and the quiet nights, there was still room for wonder. As the trains rumbled across the country and the radios played soft jazz in quiet homes, these larger-than-life faces found their way into living rooms and hearts. They lived in the flicker of film, in the hush before a scene began, in the applause that followed a final fade to black. And even now, so many years later, their glow remains, not because of what they said, but because of what they meant. And so, as the curtain falls on this part of the story, the screen dims just slightly, only to reveal another journey, one not told in close-ups, but through the wide windows of a moving train, gently rocking its passengers toward distant fields and sleeping towns. The next chapter awaits. As the stars of Hollywood lit up silver screens from coast to coast, another kind of silver moved quietly across the land. On rails, long gliding trains, their bodies gleaming like polished metal, carved gentle paths through wheat fields, across open plains, and into the hearts of cities that pulsed with new life. These weren't just machines. They were moving homes, floating dreams, steel ribbons that stitched the country together. For many, the train was more than a mode of travel. It was an experience, an event, a moment of wonder stretched out over hours. You could step onto a platform in Chicago with the soft hum of jazz still lingering in your ears, and by morning, you'd be watching the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains. And the ride itself? That was half the magic. The leather seats in the observation car were worn smooth with stories. Velvet curtains framed wide windows that let in fields of gold and skies that stretched for miles. Children pressed their noses against the glass, pointing at grazing horses or telephone poles flicking past like a metronome. And then there were the sleepers, those elegant compartments, lined with polished wood and brass fixtures, the turned-down beds with crisp white linens. A porter, dressed in perfect form, would quietly knock before nightfall to prepare the berth, tucking in the sheets, fluffing the pillow, leaving behind a sense of care that felt almost familial. In the dining car, silverware clinked softly against porcelain. The tablecloths were fresh. The menu? Seasonal, thoughtful. Chicken pot pie, perhaps, or a slice of berry cobbler. And always coffee. Hot, rich, aromatic. Not just to keep you awake, but to keep you grounded as the world outside blurred gently into motion. The rhythm of the tracks became a lullaby. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack. It soothed passengers into soft conversation, gentle reflection, or sleep that felt like it belonged to another time. One without the noise of engines, the rush of highways, the glow of endless notifications. On the train, there was nothing to do but be. To sit beside a stranger and hear a life story. to hold hands with a sweetheart under a shared blanket, to write postcards with a fountain pen, the words swaying gently with the motion of the car. Trains didn't just move people, they connected lives. A grandmother traveling to meet her first grandchild. A traveling salesman with a suitcase full of wares and a heart full of weariness. A young couple off to start a new life in a city they'd only seen in photographs. Each passenger carried more than luggage. They carried hope, longing, beginnings and endings, all bundled together in the quiet shuffle of feet down narrow aisles. And as the countryside unfolded, barns tucked into hillsides, small stations with wooden signs, men tipping their hats from platforms, there was a shared reverence, a knowing that this journey was not just about where, but about how. By the 1920s, train travel had become refined. The great railroads, Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, the Santa Fe, competed not just on speed, but on style. There were Art Deco lounges, powder rooms, smoking cars with newspapers from across the nation. Some trains even had barbershops, manicurists, or miniature libraries. But despite the luxury, the beauty of the experience remained humble. It was in the simple joy of watching rain streak across a window, the comfort of boots tucked neatly beside a bed, the soft snore of the man across the aisle, his hat tilted low over his eyes, and through it all, the country passed by, changing yet still familiar. Fields turned to towns, towns to cities, cities to darkness, and in the hush of midnight, as the train curved gently around a bend, there was often a silence so deep it felt sacred. That was when dreams stirred, not the kind in sleep, but the kind that lived in motion, in possibility. To ride the train was to believe that something better waited just beyond the next stop. As dawn approached, the sleeping car filled with the quiet rustle of waking. A conductor's call, the scent of fresh coffee again. Faces, softened by rest and perspective, peered out at a new day, and as the train slowed to a stop, it left behind not just tracks, but traces, memories, moments suspended between places. The camera now gently lifts from that soft-lit sleeping car, rising slowly into the sky, where new dreams were beginning to take flight, carried not on rails, but on wings. And so we turn to the clouds and to the early days of flying. From the steady rhythm of the rails to the soft hush of clouds, America was lifting its eyes skyward. The 1920s were not only a time of movement across the land, but above it. It was the decade when men and women first trusted their dreams to wings stitched in canvas and wood. When flying was not yet a routine, but a rare marvel. A daring act wrapped in curiosity, courage, and just a little bit of foolishness. Back then, airplanes still looked like something out of a dream. Fragile, skeletal machines with propellers that rattled and wings that creaked. They didn't glide so much as they fluttered, like uncertain birds testing the sky. At small airfields just outside of town, often nothing more than wide meadows with a hangar and a windsock, families gathered on weekends to watch pilots take off. The engines would roar, the wheels would bounce across uneven grass. And suddenly, against all logic, the plane would lift. Children squinted into the sun, mouths open. Grandmothers clutched their coats tighter, whispering prayers. And young boys, wide-eyed, knew without question that someday they, too, would fly. It was magic. loud, trembling, beautiful magic. The early pilots? They were wanderers and showmen, barnstormers who took their planes from county fair to county fair, offering 10-minute flights for a handful of coins. They wore leather helmets and long white scarves. They shook hands with farmers, waved at children, and looped their planes through the clouds as if the sky belonged to them. For many, their first flight wasn't from a city terminal. It was from a field behind a general store, with chickens scattering and neighbors cheering. The plane would groan as it rose, rattling through wind that felt too strong. And then, silence. Not the absence of sound, but a stillness. A floating world just above the one everyone knew. Inside those tiny cockpits, flying was a sensory wonder. Cold wind lashed the cheeks. The smell of fuel lingered in every breath. And the earth below, roads, rooftops, rivers, looked different. Smaller, softer. One could see for miles patchwork fields, curving tracks, glints of sunlight bouncing off lakes. It was like looking down at a moving painting. One made of memories, of a country still finding its way. Some passengers wept. Others laughed uncontrollably. Many just sat there, silent, holding on to something between awe and reverence. Commercial flight, too, was beginning, tentatively. In 1925, the first airmail routes connected cities with the speed of sky. By the late 20s, a handful of brave souls began boarding passenger flights. The cabins were loud, unpressurized, and often freezing cold. But there was coffee, and a view no train could ever offer. It wasn't about comfort, it was about wonder. Each journey was a promise that the impossible was becoming possible. That dreams, once rooted to the soil, could now reach toward the clouds. There was something deeply human about those early flights. They weren't perfect. They weren't smooth. But they meant something. They spoke of bravery, of belief, of a nation ready to climb, no matter how uncertain the sky might seem. For those who flew, it wasn't just about distance. It was about perspective, about seeing one's town from above, realizing how small a worry might look when viewed from 3,000 feet, and when the plane dipped low again, circling back toward the tiny field where it had all begun. There was often a hush, a kind of gratitude, a quiet knowing that life had just changed, even if just a little. In time, airports would grow. Planes would become smoother, faster, quieter. But in the 1920s, flying was still personal, intimate, sacred almost. It wasn't about tickets or schedules or luggage tags. It was about wonder in its purest form. As the plane touched back down, wheels skimming earth, dust rising in its wake, America continued to rise. Cities would soon stretch upward, like mountains made of glass and steel. The skyline itself would become a symbol of growth, of ambition, of all that was yet to come. And so, we turn from the open skies to the towering forms of a new America, one built not on wings, but on stories stacked floor by floor. As the last whisper of wind faded from the wings of the early flyers, America turned its gaze from the sky back down to the streets. But what met their eyes was no longer the same old ground. The city, once sprawling outward in slow, familiar ripples, was now climbing, not just building, but reaching, upward, It began in quiet ways. Steel beams rising like bare trees from concrete soil. Wooden scaffolding wrapped around half-formed dreams. Men in caps and overalls hoisting bricks, rivets, and window panes into the sky, one floor at a time. And before long, the city wasn't just a place you lived in, it was something you looked up at. Skyscrapers were the new cathedrals, not places of worship, exactly, but symbols of belief. Belief in progress, ambition, and a future still unfolding. In Chicago, in New York, in downtowns all across the country, buildings of glass, steel, and stone began to reshape the very idea of what a city could be. By day, they glittered in the sunlight like polished gems. By night, their windows lit up like stars, constellations with names like Chrysler, Woolworth, and Empire. There was something poetic about it all, as if the same country that once looked westward to conquer mountains had now decided to build them instead. From ground level, life was changing too. The sidewalks grew busier, faster. Streetcars rattled between avenues. Boys sold papers on corners. Music spilled from phonograph shops and soda fountains. Women in cloche hats hurried past window displays, their heels tapping like typewriters, and above them, construction crews balanced on steel girders, hundreds of feet in the air, eating lunch with their legs dangling over the edge. They didn't just build towers, they danced with gravity. It was dangerous. It was daring. It was new. In apartment buildings, elevators became more common. No longer did you have to climb endless stairs to reach the 5th floor. A small box with a gate and a button could now carry you up. Quietly, gently, as if the city itself was lifting you toward possibility. From those upper stories, life looked different. The street noise softened. The horizon stretched wider. And at night, with the window cracked open and the radio playing faintly inside, the air felt cooler, quieter, like standing between worlds. There was beauty in this vertical life, even in the small, overlooked things. The mail slot in the hallway door, the smell of hot pipes in the winter, the groan of radiators and the creak of floorboards one level up, and from the fire escape, a view of the city breathing. On Sundays, people stood on rooftops just to feel the sun. Children played with kites. Men read the paper. Mothers watered potted plants, their aprons fluttering in the breeze. It wasn't luxury, but it was life, layered, stacked, humming with stories. Yet amid all the movement, upward and onward, there remained a softness to the city. Old brick buildings still stood next to new towers. Flower carts still rolled through cobblestone alleys. The church bell still rang at noon, echoing between glass facades. Progress had come, but it hadn't erased memory. The past and future walked side by side, like two old friends learning how to move forward without letting go. By the end of the decade, the skyline was no longer flat. It spoke now, in shadows, in silhouettes, in lines drawn against the evening sky. The city had become a promise, a symbol, a poem in steel and light, and those who lived in it, whether on the ground or 30 stories above, felt part of something bigger, something growing, something bold. But not everything was marble and metal. Just beyond the storefronts and skyscrapers, there were still small delights, places where wonder was sold in glass jars and paper bags, where the floor tiles gleamed and the chandeliers sparkled like rain. Those places are waiting just ahead. Let us step inside next, into the grand department stores of the 1920s, where shopping wasn't just shopping, it was an experience. As the American city grew upward, so did its appetite for beauty, comfort, and delight. And so, nestled among the steel and stone towers, something extraordinary began to take shape, not just in the skyline, but in the hearts of everyday people. A new cathedral of modern life was rising, but this one didn't echo with sermons. It shimmered with perfume, polished brass, and the soft click of heels across marble. It was the grand department store, and to many, it felt like stepping into a dream. In New York, it was Macy's, its red star a beacon in the winter air. In Chicago, it was Marshall Field's, so elegant it could take your breath away before you even passed through the great revolving doors. Outside, streetcars passed by and shoe shiners worked their posts. But inside was another world entirely. There were chandeliers hung like upside-down bouquets of crystal, columns as tall as trees, escalators with polished wood rails gliding silently between floors, and above it all, the scent of everything. Fresh cut flowers, roasted nuts, face powder, and fine leather gloves. It was shopping, yes, but it was also theater. Children stared wide-eyed at the toy floors, where electric trains looped through miniature towns, and dolls blinked from behind glass cases. Ladies floated between hat counters and glove departments, escorted by attendants in starched collars and white gloves. Men wandered into the book section or stood at the cigar counter, watching the day drift by beneath golden light. At Christmas time, the entire store transformed. Trees sparkled, choirs sang, windows told stories in motion, animated displays of elves, snowflakes, and reindeer in motion. Even the most hurried shopper paused, spellbound. There was something democratic about it all. Whether you were buying a silver teapot or just a single spool of thread, the floors gleamed just the same beneath your shoes. The elevators opened with the same grace. The perfume misted the air for everyone, not just the wealthy. It made people feel seen, important, worthy. For a young girl with her mother, dressed in her Sunday best, it could feel like a royal procession. Climbing the escalator to see the better dresses, hearing the pianist play near the tea room, and holding a paper bag stamped with the name of the store in elegant cursive. There was no rush. Time inside the department store felt slower, gentler. People lingered. They spoke softly. They admired things they could not afford, not with envy, but with hope. Someday, perhaps, someday I'll buy that lamp, that coat, that crystal dish. But for now, it was enough to be there, to be part of it. Sometimes, it wasn't the things that made the biggest impression. It was the experience, a sales lady remembering your name, the quiet joy of trying on something new, a moment shared between sisters at the makeup counter, whispering over lipsticks, a father buying a ribbon for his daughter's hair, a woman pausing to gaze into a mirror, not to judge herself, but to wonder who she was becoming. By the late 1920s, department stores weren't just stores anymore. They were landmarks, meeting places, symbols of how far the country had come. They offered not just goods, but grace, a chance to walk in and feel, if only for a little while, like life was grander, fuller, more beautiful than the world outside. And even long after the doors closed for the evening, The feeling lingered on your coat, in your memory, like the last chord of a piano before the hush. Outside again, the evening settled over the city. Neon signs flickered on, street lamps glowed, and people made their way home, their arms full of parcels and their minds full of color. The city kept moving, but something had shifted. America had discovered the joy of leisure, not just necessity. And the weekend was beginning to take on a new kind of meaning. Let's follow it now. To the beaches, the boardwalks, the laughter under the sun. After a day spent beneath chandeliers and marble floors, people longed for something simpler. The city shimmered with elegance. But outside its doors, something even more powerful was taking shape. The weekend. A new kind of freedom. A short escape from labor and routine, reserved not just for the rich, but for the everyman. And with it came a new ritual, the Great American Day Trip. It began with a modest plan. A packed lunch, a folded blanket, a change of shoes tossed into the back seat of a Ford, and then the open road, just wide enough to chase the sunlight. The destination didn't matter so much. What mattered was the feeling of moving, of breathing, of stepping out of the usual rhythm. For many, that meant heading toward the coast, or a lake, or a grassy hill beside the highway. There, families unfolded their weekends like a picnic blanket. Barefoot children chased seagulls and one another. Mothers rested in the shade with novels open on their knees. Fathers rolled up their sleeves and grilled sausages on tiny portable stoves. The air smelled of sunscreen and hot dogs, salt and wildflowers. And somewhere, always, there was music. Scratchy jazz from a portable radio, or the rhythmic lull of waves lapping against the shore. For children of the 1920s, these outings became core memories. A first taste of vanilla ice cream, already melting down their fingers. A sunburn that turned into freckles by August. The sticky sweetness of lemonade in a glass bottle. The laughter that came so easily when the grown-ups weren't rushing. These weren't grand vacations. There were no plane tickets or resort hotels, but they were real, and they were theirs. And what a wonder it was to see one's parents relax, to watch your mother take off her hat and let the wind mess her hair, to hear your father tell a joke, not the kind from the dinner table, but the silly kind, the kind that made him sound like a boy again, to feel, if only for an afternoon, like time had paused just for your family. In seaside towns, boardwalks came to life. Vendors sold taffy in paper boxes and soda pop in glass cups. Ferris wheels creaked gently in the wind, and couples strolled hand in hand past arcades and candy stands. Everyone was welcome. Shopgirls and sailors, secretaries and schoolboys. You could dip your toes into the surf or simply sit and watch the horizon. It was enough. The weekend became a sacred thing. It wasn't just a break from work. It was a time to connect. Parents with children, lovers with each other, strangers with a shared breeze. It was America learning how to rest. And even back in the city, when Monday came again, you could still feel the sand between your shoes. You could still hear the waves, tucked somewhere in memory. The weekend changed people, not by giving them more, but by reminding them how much they already had. As the decade marched on, this new rhythm took hold. 5 days of work, 2 for freedom. And those 2 days, they became treasured. a ride to the coast, a cone of strawberry ice cream, a breeze off the bay, a moment of stillness. The American dream wasn't always about more. Sometimes it was about enough. And so, with sunburned noses and full hearts, people returned home, tired in the best way. The kind of tired that comes not from work, but from living, the kind that made even a small house feel like a castle, and even a simple supper feel like a feast. In that glow of early evening, lights flicked on across the country. Screen doors creaked open. Radios hummed softly. Children fell asleep with sand still clinging to their ankles. And as America exhaled, a new kind of life was quietly blooming, one shaped not by survival, but by joy. Let's follow that feeling now. To a world moving faster than ever before. To a nation spinning into the future. Never quite looking back, because after all, the 1920s were not standing still. They were roaring forward. The breeze from the beach still lingered in their hair, sun-kissed skin, tired legs, but inside the quiet hum of those returning cars, something else was moving, not just people, but the country itself. The 1920s had begun like a whisper after thunder, gentle, hopeful. But by the end of the decade, that whisper had become a full-throated hum, vibrating through every corner of American life. Motion was everywhere. You could feel it in the way dresses swayed with every step, shorter, looser, lighter. In the quick tap of heels on tiled department store floors, in the roar of a Ford engine starting at dawn for no reason other than to go. America wasn't sitting still anymore. It was stretching its limbs. It was chasing itself down the road. The rhythm of daily life had changed. People woke earlier, moved faster. A letter didn't take weeks to arrive anymore. A phone call could shrink 1,000 miles in seconds. Trains stitched together cities and farmland like thread through cloth. The idea of distance, of waiting, was becoming old-fashioned. It was in the air, too, this motion. Not just in airplanes or Model Ts, but in spirit. People no longer wanted to simply be. They wanted to become. A shop girl dreamed of Hollywood. A farmer listened to jazz and thought about Chicago. A boy delivering newspapers imagined owning his own press. Everyone had somewhere to go, even if they couldn't name the place yet. The decade made dreamers out of the practical. There was something almost electric about the times. It hummed beneath floorboards, inside radios, behind every storefront window. A new shop would open, and the line would form before sunrise. A new movie would debut, and hearts would swell before the credits rolled. Even the way people walked changed. Less shuffle, more purpose. That motion came with contradictions, of course. It left some behind. It blurred the view for those who moved too fast, but still, it was irresistible. Because for the first time, motion didn't just belong to the wealthy or the powerful. It belonged to everyone. A young couple could save for 2 years and take a train west just because they wanted to see the Rockies. A school teacher could buy a car and visit her sister without asking a man to drive. A child could dream of radio waves, of airplanes, of something bigger than his street. And while the American dream had always been a story of becoming, now it was a story of doing. Something deep was shifting. People weren't just filling their days. They were choosing them, choosing to go out on Sundays, choosing to spend 5 cents on a cone of chocolate ice cream, choosing to sit in a movie theater and escape into someone else's life for an hour. Freedom didn't always roar. Sometimes it quietly knocked on the door and said, "Would you like to come with me?" And people did. They followed. They leapt, not because they were certain of what came next, but because it felt better than standing still. In those twilight years of the decade, no one knew what lay ahead, but they felt something in their bones, a restlessness, a racing heartbeat beneath the surface. Everything was faster, smoother, more connected. The world wasn't quite small yet, but it had gotten closer. And deep inside this motion, within all the jazz and laughter and lights, there was hope. Hope that life could be made, not just received. That change didn't have to be feared. That tomorrow might just be better than today. As the nation moved forward, on roads, rails, and through dreams, it left behind an old skin, a slower version of itself, quieter, safer, predictable, and in its place, something bold, something beautiful, something that would never be the same again. Soon, the motion would meet resistance. Storms would come. Walls would rise. But for now, America danced in motion. Wide-eyed and open-hearted, let's slow the rhythm now. Let the noise drift away and prepare to rest in the final hush of this roaring story. The lights had dimmed. The last ice cream cone had melted under the sun. The car ride home had grown quiet. Only the hum of the road and the sigh of the wind remained. And just like that, the decade began to whisper its goodbyes. The 1920s had danced in with sequins and jazz, with bold lipstick and fast-moving tires. But here, in the hush of night, it rested. A nation once draped in Victorian lace had slipped into something new, looser, braver, more alive. The transformation wasn't just seen in the skyline or heard on the radio. It was felt in the way people dreamed. From the factory towns of Michigan to the glowing sidewalks of New York, from cotton fields to beachside boardwalks, people were beginning to believe that life could be more than survival. It could be joy. It could be movement. It could be their own. Hearts had opened like windows on a warm spring night. Music flowed freely. Voices traveled invisibly through the air. Trains rolled on like lullabies across plains and mountains. And for the first time in a long time, America let out a breath it hadn't known it was holding. It was not a perfect decade. There were shadows that clung to the edges. Inequality, injustice, unseen pain behind the parties, a growing restlessness beneath the glitter. But that's the truth of any time worth remembering. It was beautiful, and it was flawed, and still it pulsed with the heartbeat of hope. Now, as we sit quietly in this present moment, 100 years removed from flappers and Ford engines, we close our eyes and still feel the echo. A jazz note drifts, a soft shoe taps, the scent of salt water and gasoline lingers like a memory. The people of that era are long gone, but their dreams, they drift gently over us, like the thin white curtains of a porch window on a summer night. Somewhere in that decade, a child looked at the stars from a motel parking lot and whispered, "Someday, I'll fly." Somewhere else, a young woman walked alone into a city, heels clicking like punctuation on a new sentence of her life. And somewhere quieter still, a man came home after war, kissed his baby's forehead, and chose to stay. These small moments, these quiet revolutions, they're what shaped the century to come. So tonight, we remember them, not as history, but as people, full of laughter and longing and flaws and fire. They were us just 100 years earlier, and the things they cherished, family meals, songs on the radio, Sunday drives, falling asleep by the fire, are still here if we slow down enough to notice. As the fire crackles softly in the distance and the wind moves gently through time, let's hold the memory close, not just of a roaring decade, but of the quieter truths tucked beneath it. The truth that love outlasts noise, that gentleness has power, and that progress, true progress, starts in small human ways. We'll leave the lights low now. We've told our story. And the 1920s, well, they'll wait for us in dreams, back in the jazz clubs, on quiet porches, in the rumble of a distant train, still whispering, still dancing, still there. Sleep well tonight. And if you happen to dream in black and white, know that somewhere a phonograph is still spinning and someone is still swaying to the music. Until next time, and as always, good night.